You'll learn vocabulary connected to housing and accommodation in this episode, so you can talk about different places where people live. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are things, my friend?
Things are really good, thank you. The conversation course is finishing soon. I've been very happy with the students. We've had a lot of fun. And another course is starting very soon. So if anybody's interested in joining the next conversation course, why don't you sign up for our newsletter over at inglespodcast.com and I'll let you know details of the next conversation course. How are you, Reza?
I'm doing very well, I must say. We're recording this in January, although you might be listening to it in February. So it's slightly cold by Valencian standards, but I'm enjoying that because we don't get much cold weather here in Valencia, and it's nice to get a little bit of crisp, cold weather from time to time, just to break up the monotony, so to speak, of warm, sunny days all year. Don't you think?
Yeah, I like it when it's cold and sunny. I like being outside in cold weather when the sun's on my face. I think it's a lovely time of year.
Me too, with really, really blue skies. Yeah, but cold. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly. If this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. And if you're back again, thank you for listening. What's first this week, Reza?
Well, let's start off with a voice message from a listener in Spain called Cristina.
Hello, Reza. Hello, Craig. This is Cristina from Marbella, Spain, where I have just moved to live with my family. I've started listening to your podcast this year, and I am so much grateful for helping me to improve my English skills, especially the listening ones. Your podcasts are very, very useful for me. Now, I would like to learn the difference between near and close, because I usually make mistakes using both words. Thank you very much again and have a happy, happy new year.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's lovely to hear your voice. And Christina is a student who is on the conversation course at the moment. Thanks very much, Christina, for sending in your message. And before we answer your question, any comments, Reza, on things that Christina said in her message? Anything we can improve?
Thanks very much for your message, Christina. It was all perfectly clear to me. Having said that, there were a couple of things which grammatically we could correct. I think you said, I'm so much grateful. But there we can't put in the word much because the word much always goes with a noun. But you don't have a noun in that sentence. You only have an adjective. Yeah, we talk about so much love, so much war, etc.
So much money.
So much money, we wish. But grateful is an adjective, so we can't have the word much without a noun. So just say, I'm so grateful. Forget about the word much. But if she wanted to put in a word, Craig, she could put in an adverb, couldn't she?
Yes, you can also say, I'm really grateful for the work you do. I'm extremely grateful, or I'm very grateful. So those adverbs will emphasize grateful and make it stronger. Now, about your question, Christina, you asked about the difference between close and near. Now, they are very, very similar for speaking about distance, aren't they, Reza?
Yes, to be honest, there isn't really any difference when you're talking about distance. I tell you what, we'll give you a few examples, Christina, and you'll see what we mean. If I said to you, my friend lives near the sea, that's fine.
Are you talking about me?
Yes, indeed, Craig does live near the sea. In fact, we can see the sea right now. the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. So Craig lives near the sea, but I could also say Craig lives close to the sea. It's the same thing. But you'll notice there I said close to. You add to with the word close when you're talking about distance. I'll give you another example. Valencia is near Barcelona, or Valencia is close to Barcelona. Near, close to, doesn't really matter. But be careful, don't say near plus to. A lot of people do. Not only my students, but I've noticed even some native speakers starting to do it, but it isn't right. It doesn't sound very wrong, but it is wrong. And if you do an English exam, they'll consider it wrong. So near, no preposition, but close to.
And close is often used when we speak about relationships. For example, my sister and I are very close, which means we have a good relationship. So I would not use near to speak about relationships. And I think we are quite close. We are close friends. So when you have a good relationship with someone, you can say that you're close.
Apart from that, Christina, the only difference I can really think of, apart from those two things we've mentioned, is a few collocations. Now, we've spoken about collocations before. That refers to the fact that certain words just conventionally go together. Why? Just because they do. There could be another way of saying it, but we've decided that we prefer, or the convention is, to say it a certain way. Can you think of any typical collocations with either near or close?
There's one that comes to mind, near and far. For example, I could say, when I was younger, I travelled a lot. I travelled near and far, which means I went to places that were near to me, and I also travelled to places that were far from me.
I've just thought of another one. A near-death experience. We never say close. We always use the word near for that. A near-death experience is one of those situations where a person nearly dies, or maybe even technically has died for a few seconds, but somehow they survive, they come back to life. Maybe their heart stopped beating or their brain function stopped for a few seconds, but then started again. And quite often people report that they feel like they were actually dead for a few seconds, but then somehow came back to life. That's a near-death situation. We don't use the word close for that because that's the collocation. The words go together. Near-death experience or near-death situation.
Do you remember that song by Sting, Don't Stand So Close to Me? Don't stand so close to me, but not near to me. So, Christina, remember that you don't use to with near, but you do use to with close to somebody.
And there's also the expression close together. We never say near together. It's always close together. Yeah, so for example, there were a lot of people standing in the main square to watch the fireworks display in Valencia. No surprise. And they were all standing close together. Yeah. The distance between everybody was very, very short. In fact, if I know Valencian fires, they were probably actually touching each other physically, the bodies. They were standing very close together. We don't use near for that one.
Not something we did very often during the pandemic, was it? To stand close together. Thank you very much for your message, Christina, and for your question that we found very, very interesting. Next, we have a voice message from a friend of the show, Daniel from Switzerland.
Hello, Craig and Reza. This is Daniel Goodson speaking from Switzerland. I'm currently going for a walk with my dog. And congratulations to your episode. I think it was called 8 Common Colloquial Expressions. And as you might know me, this is really right up my alley. So the last expression was about brainstorming, I think. And I thought I want to give you some ideas for a future episode. So the idea is to talk about artificial intelligence in the context of language learning. To be more specific, I want to mention the chatbot, which is called ChatGPT. This chatbot is so powerful that it can help you or support you in your English learning journey. And this would be a huge topic. And I am also researching and practicing with the chatbot.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your message. Always a pleasure to hear from you. And Daniel does have his own podcast called My Fluent Podcast. In fact, he spoke about fluency with podcasting back in episode 437. So if you want to get some tips on how to improve your fluency, go to inglespodcast.com/437 to listen to my conversation with Daniel. So he used a lovely expression, Reza, didn't he? Something about an alley, which is a small road or space between two buildings. What was that expression?
Yes, thanks for your message, Danielle. And I liked the way you said that it was right up my alley. If something is right up my alley, I've also heard people say right up my street sometimes as well. It means that it's exactly the type of thing that you like or enjoy. It fits in with your taste or your likes. It's right up your alley. It's right up your street. Or you could also say it's your cup of tea is another variation, a very British one. It's your cup of tea. It's right up your alley.
It floats your boat. You can say as well, it really floats my boat. But Daniel spoke about ChatGPT, which, as he said, is a chatbot, which has recently been launched onto the market, which means introduced to the internet by a company called OpenAI back in November last year, 2022. Now, I think it's a wonderful idea to talk about AI for language learning, but I think we'll wait for a while to see what happens with ChatGPT because people are still experimenting with it. We're still looking at the possibilities of it. It's still in beta, I think. I suspect it might be a paid service soon. So if you want to play with it, now is a good time to do it. And I'll put a link in the show notes over at inglespodcast.com/452. I'll put a link there for you to try it if you want to. You do have to give your telephone number when you sign up. So they want an email address from you and your telephone number. But if that's okay with you, and I gave my number and I've been trying it and I made a video about it. So if you want to watch that YouTube video, I'll also put that link in the show notes. And we do promise that we'll speak about that in the future, Daniel.
Yeah, it's probably best if we wait a while before talking about AI because it's one of those things which changes by the week, if not by the day. So it probably wouldn't be a good idea for us to release a podcast too soon about AI because there are so many brand new developments happening right now that if we record something now, within about 6 months, a lot of the information might be redundant. So it's better for us to wait a while and see what the latest developments are before we release a podcast about AI.
Yeah, but I do agree with you, Daniel. It is a fascinating toy to play with for language learning, and I've been using it. And if people want more information, go to the show notes for this episode and follow the links that I've included. So, Reza, this week we're going to focus on accommodation and places to live. Where do you live?
I live, like most people in Valencia, in a flat, or as they would say in American English, an apartment. So I would say, at least 90%, if not more, of people in all Spanish cities, actually, live in a flat or an apartment. But Craig, that's not the case in the UK, is it?
No, in the UK, people tend to live in houses. I think the majority of people live in houses, and there are different types of houses. So one example of a house is a detached house. Now, you probably know the word attached. If you send an email, maybe you attach a document to an email, you join it with something. But if something is detached, it is not attached. So logically, a detached house stands in its own space, its own grounds. There's no house to the left of it, there's no house to the right of it, and unlike a flat or an apartment, there's nothing upstairs and there's nothing downstairs. It's your house and it's detached.
I would say that possibly the most common type of housing of all in the United Kingdom and Ireland is a semi-detached house. It may be, or if not, a terraced house. Let's take semi-detached first. So Craig's explained detached. Semi-detached means, well, nearly detached. In other words, you've got one neighbour on one side. In other words, it's specifically two houses together. Not three, not one, specifically just two. So nearly detached. You only have to put up with, you only have to tolerate neighbours on one side.
Tolerate.
You're not completely detached. You might think, well, why not just get a detached house? Obviously, it's going to be more expensive. And not everybody has the money for that. So that's why semi-detached houses are extremely popular in Britain and Ireland, because for an affordable price, more or less, if you're lucky, you get quite a lot of privacy. You've only got the neighbours on one side, but it doesn't cost you a fortune.
That's right. And possibly a cheaper house, even cheaper than semi-detached, would be a terraced house. So TERRACED. A terraced house is attached on both sides. So there's a row of houses that are joined together. Now, as Reza said, a semi-detached is attached on one side, so they're sharing one wall in the middle. But a terraced house, you're sharing two walls, unless you are at one of the two ends of the line of houses. So terraced houses are joined together, and they're sometimes called townhouses, which sounds a bit nicer, but the idea is the same. So you're living in a flat now, Reza. What kind of house did you grow up in Belfast?
I grew up in a terraced house, and it was right in the middle. And I used to be really jealous of the people who had the end houses at the end of the row.
But aren't they colder and more difficult to heat?
That's the thing, yeah. I realized later that they would have had to spend a lot more money trying to heat the house. You don't have to worry about the summer it being too hot. No, not in Ireland. You don't need to worry about that. You only need to worry about the winter, about it being too cold, because a lot of the heat went out of the end wall, as we call it. Whereas if you're in the middle, you've got neighbours on either side, so you don't need to worry about that problem. So there are advantages and disadvantages about being the end house. Maybe I shouldn't have been so jealous. What about you, Craig? What type of house did you grow up in?
Well, I grew up in a semi-detached, although later my parents moved to a bungalow, which we'll talk about later. A bungalow is a house on only one level, one floor. So I kind of got to know those two different types of housing when I lived in the UK, semi-detached and a bungalow. Let's go a bit closer to home with our houses and move away from typical houses of the UK. Very common on the Mediterranean, in the Mediterranean area, and I think it's an Italian word, villa, V-I-L-L-A. So typically in our area of Spain and Italy and around the Mediterranean, villas are quite common.
Yeah, a villa will be a nice house in the countryside, but it will have a certain amount of luxury. There's a good chance a villa has a little swimming pool. Maybe not, but there's a good chance. A nice garden. And it will be designed for country living. And above all, as Craig said, supposing that there'll be quite a lot of good weather.
Yes.
Most of the time. Yeah, there will be some bad weather in the winter, but villas, we think of typical Mediterranean climates.
Yeah, sunshine for sure. And a similar word in the French language, chateau. is quite commonly used in English as well. So when you say chateau, you probably think of France and a similar kind of house, but in the French countryside.
Although with chateau, I think it's definitely going to be an old building. A chateau is going to be old, right? A villa could be an old villa, a really old villa, or it could be very modern. It could be built this year. But for chateau, I always think of an old building. Don't you? That old style.
That's
French
true.
Building. Yeah,
I agree with that. Yeah. What would you think of if I said to you a manor house? MANOR. What picture comes to your mind?
I would think of money, somebody with a lot of money. Because a manor house is a very typical British thing, but not many people have one. It's the type of house that an aristocrat or a very rich person might have in the countryside, not in the city. And it will be really, really big. It possibly has quarters, living rooms for servants, and it'll be very old.
With space around it, with grounds and gardens and a driveway leading up to the front door, lots of room and trees and space. Yeah.
Think of, I don't know if any of you listeners are fans of Downton Abbey, that type of thing, this TV series Downton Abbey. They live in a manor house. Well, the rich ones in the series live in the manor house. The servants perhaps live there, or they get to come and go every day. So that type of building is a manor house.
So we've been going up gradually in price and size, haven't we? From terraced and semi-detached up to chateau, manor house. Let's go up even more to a mansion.
What, like the Mansion Inglés?
Like the Mansion Inglés. Well, no, not English mansion, because I think you discovered that if you Google English mansion, you get a pornography site that specializes in sadomasochism. So be careful what you Google. A mansion is a very, very large manor house, obviously expensive and probably in the countryside. But we can go up one step higher than a mansion, can't we?
Yes, so mansion is already pretty impressive, but it isn't quite a castle. Not many people obviously live in a castle these days, but the odd person does. When I say odd, I don't mean strange, I mean odd, not very many. Somebody who comes from a very, very old, well-established, aristocratic, maybe even royal family might have a castle or two. Like the British royal family, they've got Edinburgh Castle, Balmoral Castle, and a few other places. So some lucky few live in a castle.
They've also got palaces, haven't they? They've got Kensington Palace, Buckingham Palace, and there's another famous one in the UK, Buckingham Palace, which is the house of David and Victoria Beckham.
Really? They call it Buckingham Palace?
Apparently. So yeah, palaces, castles are also types of accommodation. Remember, if you want to see this vocabulary listed in text, go to inglespodcast.com/452 for this episode 452.
Let's get our feet back on the ground now. Let's go back to more reasonable accommodation. Let's forget about the castles and chateaux and mansions for a while and think of more humble types of housing. In all countries in the world, I guess, there must be some type of farmhouse. And for the English-speaking world, it's no exception. So a farmhouse, for me, as an English speaker, I will think of a house which is probably old, but some are not as old as others, but it's probably old. Why do I say that? Because let's be honest, nobody really builds new farms these days, do they? And
there's no money in it.
There's no money in it. That's why farmhouses are going to be, well, they don't have to be really old, but they're going to be at least 60 or 70 years old, and they might be 400 years old even. But nobody really in the UK has built a farmhouse since about 1960 or 70 because there's no money in it. So a farmhouse, it's going to be old. It might even be really old. And it's probably a really solid, well-built place. Yeah, you think of farmhouses as being thick walls, because the farmer and his or her family, they're going to be there in the hard winter months. They're going to want a place which is going to stand up to the elements. And it obviously will have lots and lots of land around it. I wouldn't say the word grounds there. Craig used the word grounds to talk about the big area of land around a manor house or a mansion, or perhaps a palace. But for a farmhouse, we would just say land because there'll be animals on the land. Grounds are more for like pleasure with parks, with trees, etc. But for a farmhouse, you have land around it with animals or perhaps crops, corn, potatoes, carrots, whatever you're growing things on the land. And it will have a very, very rural look, obviously.
I mentioned that I lived in a bungalow earlier. A bungalow is a house that is on one level, so there's no upstairs. The bedrooms are on the same level as the entrance and the lounge and the kitchen. So you walk into the house and everything is on the same level, no stairs. So I lived in a bungalow for a few years in the UK.
That's a very important distinction between the Spanish word bungalow, because I know in Spain you have this word, in Spanish I should say. I can't speak about South American Spanish, I don't know so well. But in Spain, when someone refers to un bungalow in Spanish, it's not the same as a British bungalow. As far as I understand, in Spain, un bungalow can have more than one floor. I've been in what people call bungalow, and it's had 2 or 3 floors. So it's a different meaning in Spanish to bungalow. A British or an English language bungalow definitely means that there's only one level. There's no more than one floor. That's a strict definition of bungalow.
Another place where people can live is a cottage. Be careful of the pronunciation of that word. The spelling is a bit confusing. It's C-O-T-T-A-G-E, but the A is pronounced I. It's a cottage. And a cottage, imagine a lovely, small, picturesque, beautiful little house in the English countryside, maybe in a village, or those typical English houses that you see on a chocolate box. You buy a box of chocolates, you've got a lovely English cottage with a small garden with roses. It's a charming image of a country cottage.
It may even, if it's very old, have a thatched roof.
Yes.
Thatched, that means that the roof is made out of dry grass, which is straw. Yeah. It may be thatched, T-H-A-T-C-H-E-D, thatched. Not many of those left, but it used to be a common sight in the English countryside.
Another place you can live in if you live in the woods is a cabin. Now, when I think of a cabin, I think of a house made of wood that's quite basic. It's not necessarily incredibly comfortable, although it could be. But usually a cabin in the woods or a cabin in the mountains is a very, very remote place where you might go for a particular purpose. Maybe you're going hunting, maybe you're going skiing. So a cabin is a very remote place away from urban areas.
And a kind of downscaled version of a cabin would be a hut. To downscale means to move to smaller accommodation. So a hut is similar to a cabin, but probably even smaller. Cabins can be a reasonable size, not really big, but they might have 3, 4, maybe 5 rooms if you're lucky. But a hut is basically just one room, or maybe one room divided in 2 if you're lucky, like a very small cabin.
Another place with probably only one room is a tree house, which is obviously a house in a tree. And we mentioned earlier that Reza and I both live in flats or in American English apartments. If you have many flats together in the UK, it's called a block of flats. But in America, you'd be living in an apartment block. And if the apartment block is very high and the office block is very high, it's called a skyscraper. And skyscrapers are very common in cities like New York and Chicago. There's very high buildings that almost touch or scrape the sky.
Craig, there aren't as many skyscrapers in Europe as there are in some other countries, but do you happen to know where the tallest skyscrapers in Europe are?
Not far from us, I think, Benidorm.
That is correct.
I think it's got the highest hotel in Europe.
Yep. So the highest buildings, skyscrapers, in Europe are actually in Benidorm. Not London, not Paris, not Madrid, but Benidorm. All prepared for the British tourists to arrive.
And at the top of a very high skyscraper or apartment block, you might find a penthouse, which is a very luxurious and probably expensive apartment or flat with a wonderful view and a very, very comfortable and expensive place to live.
Another place which is expensive to live, considering the size, is a loft. Or some people might call it a loft apartment. So it will be up at the top of a building. You might have to go up quite a lot of stairs to get there. But it'll look cool, you know? It'll look really, really cozy, really nice, really cool, really trendy. But it's going to cost you a lot of money for every meter. You probably won't have a lot of space, but it will look cool, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. And if you buy it in a place like New York, it's probably going to cost you several million, actually. Just because it's small doesn't mean that a loft is cheap.
Another word you may hear, especially in American English, is condo, C-O-N-D-O. Condo is short for condominium. And a condominium is a apartment or flat that very often has a doorman. So there's somebody there to open the door for you and bring you packages, etc. And you often pay fees for housing. Fees, that's the amount of money you pay on a regular basis for a service. So you're probably paying housing fees communally for the building, everybody together. There could be a gym in the basement, for example. You'll probably be paying for that. There may be a shared laundry room where you can wash your clothes in the basement. So these places are more often owned than rented, but they are very common in certain parts of the US. That's a condo or condominium, a shared apartment building.
And there are some condominiums in this area. I've seen quite a few in Alicante province. In Valencia, there's some as well. They tend not to be quite as, let's say, luxurious as American condos. They often in Spain, they actually don't have a doorman. Some do, some don't. But they do tend to have things like maybe a communal swimming pool, and a few might have a gym or a tennis court, perhaps. So a slightly less luxurious version does exist in Spain of condos.
Have you seen many duplexes in Valencia?
Not in Valencia, but I have again in Alicante and Murcia, that part of the world, in a few areas.
I think there are some quite close to here. They're buildings that have two separate units or two separate housing areas, and each area has its own separate entrance. So you go upstairs perhaps, or you enter downstairs through a different door, but it's actually the same building. So two families can live in a duplex, and they tend to be a bit cheaper, but also quite nice. And you have more privacy and fewer neighbours than if you're living in a flat, for example.
I guess it's kind of Spain's answer to the semi-detached house.
Yeah.
Rather than two houses side by side, they put one on top of the other in Spain. So you've only got one neighbour either above, below you, but at least you don't have any more.
So the next word, Reza, what is a bedsit, and have you ever lived in one?
Not quite.
You had to think about that for a minute, didn't you?
I had to think about it because the place I lived in, where you had lived previously, was not much bigger than a bedsit, but I think it wouldn't be quite fair to call it a bedsit. It was an apartment, but it wasn't much bigger than a bedsit.
In fact, you had to sit on the bed because there was no room to sit anywhere else.
Yeah.
It was that small.
Yeah. Or maybe, would you know the place I'm talking about? Would you call it a bedsit?
No, I wouldn't, because the kitchen was separate. My definition of a bedsit is a place where the kitchen could be in the same room as you're sleeping. It's really small. Now, I have a friend who years ago had a bedsit in the UK, and I used to visit him quite a lot. So it was a bedroom, and he had the kitchen really close to where he slept. It was ridiculously small, a separate toilet, separate bathroom, but a really small space where you had your dinner, your food, you watched TV, you slept more or less in the same room. Really, really small.
I guess these places were really invented or they became popular probably around about the 1920s or 30s, I would say, is when they started to appear. When basically, because of migration to cities, young people, originally men, but later from the 60s onwards, some women as well, went and they had to find accommodation for jobs that they'd started in the cities, but they obviously didn't have much money. I think really bed sits came into being. Yeah, they were invented for that type of person. So you would have just enough money to pay a very small rent and live on your own, but literally in a room. And why? Because you'd had to leave your hometown to come and live in a big city. I think they really appeared for that reason. Would you say so?
Well, I think that was the demand for them, but the supply came from people who bought very big houses and realized that if they divided those houses into separate bedsit units, they could rent out 4 or 5 and get 4 or 5 rents coming in rather than renting out a big house with only one rent. So they could make more money if they divided up the property. Obviously, the demand had to be there, you're right, but also it was thinking of how to maximize their profit by renting out those bedsits.
So they're not such a modern invention. Well, they're from the 20th century, but in the 21st century, the place I really think of where most renting bedsits occurs in the world is probably Japan and China. I think of those tiny living spaces, you see the documentaries on TV where there's a bed and literally, like in some places, the person can't even fully stand up. They would hit the head against something. They kind of have a bed and they could virtually, sorry to be so graphic, but virtually go to the toilet from the bed kind of thing. You get these mini spaces in places like Tokyo and Chinese cities. That's the kind of 21st century version of the bed sit, isn't it?
And you could use the expression, it's not big enough to swing a cat. Now, I'm not being cruel to animals. When I say swing a cat, I don't mean literally picking up a cat and swinging the cat by its tail. But if you describe a living place, an accommodation, as not big enough to swing a cat, that means it's very, very small. Now, another shared place where you could sleep is a dormitory, and sometimes abbreviated to dorm, D-O-R-M. These are very common when you're studying. You have a shared bathroom, shared toilets, and also an eating area that you'll share with other people. And you sleep in a huge room or a big room with many different beds. So you're sleeping in an open space. One bed is next to each other. And that's quite common in some schools, boarding schools, where you sleep in the same school. And a youth hostel might have dormitories where you can sleep for a very low price. Another place you could sleep in, which you can actually move from one place to another, is a mobile home. Now, a mobile home, by definition, it's mobile. You can move it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has wheels. We'll speak about those houses with wheels in a second. But a mobile home is movable. A lorry, a huge truck can come and pick up your home and take it from one plot to another. Now, the word plot, P-L-O-T, is an area of land where you can put your home. You can buy a plot of land that's empty and has nothing on it, and you can build a house on it, or you can put a mobile home on a plot of land.
Mobile homes which have wheels include a caravan. Everybody knows what that is, right? It's a container, let's say, which could be one or divided into 2 or 3 little rooms, which you can attach to a car and you can tow it, T-O-W, so it goes behind the car. Or A more modern version, you could have an RV, a recreational vehicle, which instead of having the car and the caravan separate, it's all in one. So the caravan is part of the vehicle. So you've got the space at the front for driving and then the space at the back of the same vehicle where you live. That's an RV.
But an RV will probably be more used in American English, right? We might say motorhome in the UK.
Exactly, the same thing. RV for Americans, motorhome for British people. A bit smaller perhaps, but similar to a motorhome or RV would be a camper van. Now there are many types of camper van, but for me, the only camper van, the only show in town is a Volkswagen. A Volkswagen camper van, unbeatable. What a fun! One of the best vehicles ever invented in the history of motor vehicles. Can you get cooler than a Volkswagen camper van? No, you can't. Can you?
And even the latest ones, the more modern ones, I was looking at one during the pandemic when we couldn't travel or go anywhere. Even the more modern ones are really, really nice, really cool. A lot bigger, a lot more luxurious than the VW, Volkswagen motorhomes from the 60s and flower power days of the 60s and 70s, but still a fantastic vehicle to ride around the countryside and have a holiday in. There's one more expression I think we should include here, although strictly speaking, it's not a place to live. It's not accommodation. It's a trailer park. A trailer park. And you hear that expression sometimes in films from the US. It's American English. Trailer park doesn't have a very positive reputation in the US. It's a place where people who are on a low income tend to live. And you have temporary housing there that's not particularly healthy or particularly comfortable. So a trailer park is an area where trailers or mobile homes tend to be put. And I don't know if you agree, Reza, but I would say the equivalent in the UK might be a council estate, although the difference is very clear that we're not talking about separate mobile homes on a council estate. We're talking about very cheap accommodation, sometimes subsidized by the government for people on low income.
Yes, yeah. Although I would say that living in a council estate house would be more comfortable than living in a trailer park. But yes, it's the social equivalent. Other mobile homes, but they don't have wheels, could be, of course, a tent. Have you ever spent a night in a tent, Craig?
I've spent a few nights in a tent, especially in the days when I couldn't afford a hotel. So I used to go camping because it was cheap. And when I traveled around Europe, I traveled with a tent. And I wouldn't like to live permanently in a tent, although sadly some people who have lost their homes have to. Homeless people live in tents or make temporary tents in the streets. Another place to live is a houseboat, which is obviously on water. It's a houseboat. Have you ever been on a houseboat?
No, I haven't. No. I've been on a few boats. I would call them barges, which were just for pleasure. They were pleasure boats, but nobody actually lived on them. But in the UK, there are a few people who live on boats in canals or maybe even in a marina. And so I guess you could say they live in a houseboat. In Amsterdam, of course, some people live in houseboats and a few other places. Have you ever spent a night on one?
I haven't, but it does seem quite nice to me. I think I'd like to do it. I think I'd love to maybe rent a houseboat for maybe a week and travel along the canals in France or somewhere, or the UK. I think that would be a great holiday because you see the countryside from the river or from the canal, which gives you a different perspective. And I think I'd quite like it. Reza, yesterday I went to the doctor and I said to the doctor, I'm having a couple of problems. One day I feel like a wigwam and the next day I feel like a teepee. And do you know what he said to me?
What did he say?
Sit down, you're too tense.
That's really good. I've never heard that before. That's very good, actually.
Can you explain it?
I like it, yeah. Wigwam and teepee, they're types of tents. A wigwam is a tent and a teepee is another type of tent. And you know what? They're actually very similar. In fact, some people might even use the words interchangeably. But good old Google, I did my research and I can tell you that a wigwam is the typical kind of native North American tent. So if you look at the old cowboy and Indian films, you might see the Native Americans living in a wigwam or a teepee. The difference is a wigwam was intended to be more permanent, whereas a teepee...
Sorry to interrupt you. I think a teepee is when you go to the toilet after drinking a cup of tea.
It could be that as well. Teepee. If it were a coffee, it'd be a coffee pee, right?
Exactly.
Could be.
Or a beer pee if you'd have a glass of beer.
So they're basically, they can be the same as far as I know, but in the mind of a Native American, the wigwam was their permanent home, which was a tent, whereas a teepee is the same, but it's temporary. I think that's what the difference is. But there are other types of ethnic tents, aren't there?
Well, yes, there's a yurt, Y-U-R-T, which I don't know exactly where it's from, but I know it's like a very, very big wigwam or teepee. So I think it probably houses more than one family. So if you imagine a huge marquee tent that's been put in the grounds of a manor house for a wedding reception, for example. But a yurt, I think it's round, but I'm not sure where it's from. Is it from Mongolia?
Mongolia, I think of Mongolia and maybe parts of China and that part of the world, yeah.
Other places are houses on stilts. Obviously, if you live in an area where flooding is a problem, maybe you live near a river or an estuary and you need to raise your house, you can put houses on stilts. And stilts are pieces of wood that lift the house off of the ground.
You can take it even further. In parts of Vietnam and Thailand, they live permanently on rivers. It's not that there might be water under you, there's always water. There are parts of Vietnam and Thailand and a few other countries where they've purposely built houses on the river. But obviously the house can't be in the water, so it's on stilts. And they kind of like literally wash the dishes and stuff in the river from their living room. And you want to fish, stick your hand out or maybe a fishing line and from your living room and catch a fish and then cook it. There are literally people who can do that.
Catch a fish from your bed. You can. And people sometimes live in caves. There's a place in Spain, I think, where people live in caves. In the south of Spain, I think there's an area where people lived in caves for a long time. A whole village, in fact.
What about people who obviously need to live somewhere comfortable, but they can't look after themselves? Where might they live?
Well, people like us, in a few years, Reza, it's not long now, mates. We're nearly there. We may have to go to assisted living accommodation, which is your own place. You get your own flat or maybe a bedsit, but there are staff, there are trained medical nurses and other people, carers on hand or close by who can help you if you have any mobility issues or health issues. So that's assisted living. Or if you need more care, you could go to a nursing home where there are nurses there and a doctor, a resident doctor, and your meals are cooked for you so you have less independence but more care.
There are different types of nursing home or similar things. One very important specific type of special environment for people who need help is an old people's home. Or as you say in Spanish, a residencia de tercera edad. So an old people's home, not old people's houses, that would be different. You could be an old person and live in your own house, right? An old people's home is like a nursing home, but it's specifically for old people because not all nursing homes are for old people. Some nursing homes are for people with physical or mental disabilities. They could be young. So an old people's home is where, sadly, perhaps most of us end up sooner or later. Whenever you're too old to look after yourself, you end up in an old people's home, which is a type of nursing home. Yeah, but some nursing homes are for younger people who can't look after themselves.
And speaking of places where you may need help, if you have suffered from abuse or you need help for other reasons, you could go to a shelter. And a shelter is a place that will protect you and feed you and keep you warm and clothe you, give you clothes if you're in an emergency situation. Say, for example, you are in an abusive marriage and your husband is abusing you, then you would go to live in a shelter. You'd go to a shelter for help. You also have homeless shelters for people who don't have anywhere to live and it gets very cold outside in some countries. Then you might go to a shelter to get warm, to get food, and to get some care.
But one difference between a shelter and the nursing homes or assisted living spaces is a shelter is definitely designed to be temporary accommodation, whereas a nursing home, assisted living is permanent accommodation. That's one important distinction.
So Reza, after discussing all of those places where you could possibly live, what would be your ideal home?
Well, my ideal dwelling, which is another way of saying home, DWELLING, my ideal dwelling. To dwell is to live. So a dwelling is the place where you live. It depends on comfort, affordability, ease of maintenance, and aesthetics. A mixture of those things. In other words, got to be comfortable. Don't want it to be uncomfortable. Can't be too expensive. But it has to be easy to fix if something goes wrong. It has to look nice. So I'm looking for the perfect mixture of that.
But would it be, what kind of accommodation? Would it be a flat? Would it be a penthouse? Would it be a yurt? What kind of accommodation would be your chosen place to live?
Well, if I take away the aspect of affordability, definitely a house. But in the real world, I have to factor in affordability, so it's probably not going to be a house, but I would prefer not to have neighbors either above, below, or beside me.
So detached.
Yeah, but let's be honest, I'm not going to be able to afford that for the moment. But that would be my ideal dwelling. What about yours?
I'm quite happy where I am in my flat here, in my block of flats in Valencia, although I would change two things. I would like another room because my flat is too small. And here we're recording a podcast and we're hearing the neighbours making noise and we keep stopping. So I would really like to have a place with no neighbours. So maybe it would be a duplex or something similar, or even a detached place, or even an office with that extra room that I could soundproof so that none of those disturbing noises affected our podcast. So that for me will be the perfect place. But no, I'm very happy with where I live. Well, what about you? It's your turn to practice your English. So where do you live at the moment? Can you describe it to us? And also, where would you like to live? What would be your ideal dwelling, your ideal accommodation? Send us a voice message. You can send a message using our SpeakPipe service. You have 90 seconds to speak, or you could send us two, and that will be 3 minutes. Go to speakpipe.com, speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Emails, Reza?
If you prefer to write, you could write to craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
And this podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. You can find lots of materials, courses over there at mansioningles.com, and you can also visit our online store. Go to store.mansioningles.net. And before we go out the door this week, we'd like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And you too can join our Patreon program for as little as $1.50 per month, plus the VAT tax. And you get instant access to recent transcriptions. For more information, go to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Ingles podcast. Reza, who are our most recent Patreon supporters?
A big thanks to these people who've just recently joined the scheme: Jose Francisco Prieto Lopez, Concha de la Calle, Cesar Morales, Rosa Campos, Carlos Enrique, and Benjamin Segura, who's paying more than the minimum. Thanks very much to you and all our sponsors.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Now, we don't know what we're going to be speaking about next week, but we will be back with another episode. Until next time, have a fantastic week. Let your friends know about the podcast if you enjoyed it. And until next time, it's goodbye from Reza.
And it's goodbye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.